Hi everyone. We are going to end our learning for the year with a topic that we essentially started our learning in the beginning of the year with, which is looking at religion. So before we get into our final topic, which is look at globalization and religion with the rise of global spiritualism, this is a quick snapshot of what world religions look like in the 21st century. So we can see the majority are Christian, which is obviously a huge change from the beginning of our studies. Islam is second, with about 23% of the population. The newest of these religions. Hinduism and Buddhism are still here. Judaism is still here. So our tribal faiths are continuing. The other category at 11% includes everything from Native American animist faith systems, traditional African faith systems, Shintoism of Japan, and other kind of Pacific nativist faiths. And so some changes, some continuities. But let's take a look at mostly the 20th century, although we are going to dip back into the 19th century by looking at new religious movements. So new religious movements, it's a kind of a controversial term because of how broad it is. There are so many different types of religions, and some of them are just on the total opposite ends of the earth in terms of their virtues, values, and how they treat people and all that. And some faiths are very resentful at being grouped together with certain practices, and we'll see why soon. But it's the term that we're going to use in understanding how we go from, a lot of religious faiths throughout history, but from the 19th century to the 21st century, we're talking thousands of new religions are born. And some of these are very small communities, maybe a couple dozen. Some of them are millions. But we do see this growth of religious movement in the 19th through the 21st century, especially post-World War II. And so some of these new religious movements are offshoots of established religions. We'll go over some examples of that. Some seek to reintroduce old practices, ancient wisdom, ancient practices, to kind of tap back into the earliest moments of humanity. Some are based on charismatic leaders, which can be problematic when that charismatic leader is abusive in like a cult type situation. And so, there are some examples of cults that are grouped into the new religious movements. And cults are tricky because, there's a joke in history circles and anthropology that cult plus time equals religion. And that, virtues that we might not in the modern day consider to be okay over time, they might take root. But that said, there's also some examples of very abusive and scary individuals who manipulate others to do horrible things or things that are hurtful to those individuals. And I think it's fair to say that that is cult-ish and like negative and not coming from a true desire to understand the cosmos and to understand God, which is really the point of religion. So that's why some religions are not happy to be on the same list under this new religious movements categories. And also that they range so much that some are attached to the counterculture and want to push back against mainstream culture. And others want to ramp up mainstream culture and be really traditionalist. Some of these faiths are universalist and they believe that there should be more of the ability to see the connections between all humans through God. Some push collectivism and that we should all work together. Others believe in individual spiritual salvation, and it's almost a competition to be saved and to not die in the apocalypse or whatever else. And so that's another reason why this is kind of a tough grouping to work with here. But we see a major rise in global spiritualism and these new religious movements, both because they're all reacting to the modern world. And there's a lot of craziness in the 19th through the 20th century. You have the rapid development of technology, which is really blowing people's minds and helping to share information. You also have the world wars and horrible like death and despair, and making people question like what is the point of it all. So that plus the ability to communicate these ideas through communication technology and through popular culture means we see these waves of new movements. So we're only going to go over a couple of these today. But we've studied some of them, and you know some of these. There are literally thousands, so this is a tiny slice of the new religious movements pie. But the Shakers and a lot of the utopian movements we studied about the 19th century are on this list. The Church of Latter-day Saints are on this list, and I'll talk very briefly about them. Looking at examples such as trying to tap into ancient modalities of understanding God or gods in the cosmos, we have New Age movements, right, that are looking at divining and, our horoscopes and numerology and crystals, or the Wicca movement, which was tapping into paganism and understanding nature. In the American tradition, anything to do with like evangelicalism and Pentecostalism in the South or in Appalachia is an example of the new religious movements. Satan worship is on this list, which, that's like a real thing. There are percentages of people who do worship Satan. And maybe I should have gone into more detail about that, but I didn't. But that's on the list. Early in the year, I referenced Rastafarianism. That's on this list as a Caribbean faith that was inspired by Pan-Africanism and understanding Christianity through the lens of the oppressed African peoples around the world, and the inspiration that Ethiopia held in their eyes. We're going to talk about the Bahá'í Faith and Hare Krishna. I have on here one of the examples that a lot of people classify as a cult, which is the Unification Movement, aka the Moonies, which was founded by Sungmun Moon, in South Korea. Essentially, like everything had to go through their main leader. These are the types of images that you see when you Google the Moonies. They have mass weddings. A lot of people gave up a lot of their wealth to the leadership of the Moonies movement and whatnot. And so, this is one of our examples that is classified as a cult. But let's talk about some of the early examples of the NRMs and at least kind of try to place into context some of the American examples. So Latter-day Saints is an NRM and not just like a form of Protestantism per se, because of just how much of a cultural impact it had and how it created a new culture. So the Church of Latter-day Saints is established in 1830 by Joseph Smith down here, originally in Palmyra, New York. They slowly moved towards Illinois to start their own settlements and governments. And because of how much oppression they faced by the U.S. government, they continued to go further and further west, which is why they established the main temple and community in Utah later on. And so why this becomes its own religion is because Joseph Smith has a revelation by God, which becomes the Book of Mormon. And this is huge in Christianity because essentially all Christian faiths believe that Jesus was the last word of God. But the Church of Latter-day Saints breaks from that, and they believe in the doctrine of continuing revelation, that God is still speaking to people, and that he spoke through Joseph Smith, and he continues to speak through church leaders. This is huge. This is a huge break from Christian tradition, which made other Christian traditions not just skeptical, but violent towards Mormons. And they had other associated practices. The goal would be to live in some type of like theocratic structure. Joseph Smith was like running for president when he was assassinated by an anti-Mormon mob. And so there's that. There was the expectation of what a pure life that people in the church should lead, which is why they should abstain from all substances, and an expectation of a lot of kind of pure sexual practices and marriage and stuff like that. Of course, early on, polygamy or plural marriage was an issue because it was done by a small percentage of early members of the church, although it's been abandoned by the church since the 1890s, I believe, and like very much condemned by the official church. But because of these breaks with culture, because of the threat that they seem to have posed, or at least that was the perception, um, uh, that they are considered more of an NRM than like just a new form of Protestantism. But anyway, I should talk more about that, but I'm going to move on. Here is the main temple at Salt Lake. It looks gorgeous. Another example of an American NRM, and again, not just like a new form of Protestantism, but a huge break with the Christian traditions, are the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Jehovah's Witnesses were founded by Charles Taze Russell in the 1870s. And the Jehovah's Witness worldview is pretty intense. They essentially believe that Armageddon is imminent, and that the establishment of God's kingdom on earth is the only chance we have at not totally suffering. And so, it's a millenarian belief system. And Jehovah's Witnesses believe that there isn't like infinite space in heaven, that there's only a small percentage of people who will really be saved. So this is where we get some of that sort of like that individual, not really a competition, but kind of the idea that you individually have to ensure your salvation. They also break from Christian tradition because they're non-Trinitarian. They don't believe in the idea of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They believe that that is heretical, that it kind of breaks God up, and so it distracts you when you pray to God the human versus God the Spirit and stuff like that. And other ways that they kind of break with, classic Christian tradition is that they don't do anything that isn't just directly worshiping God. So they don't honor and celebrate a lot of holidays, which includes Christmas. Even though it's a Christian holiday, the way that it's celebrated by most Christians, they think is wrong. So they'll go to church, but they're not going to be doing presents and trees and anything like that. They don't practice any non-religious holidays, so anything like Halloween or 4th of July, nope, not okay. One's own birthday isn't acknowledged. They are forbidden from doing the Pledge of Allegiance or enlisting in the military and stuff like that. They, similar to all forms of Christianity, including the Church of Latter-day Saints, there's a heavy emphasis on proselytizing, and bringing people into their faith system. Which, if you believe that Armageddon's coming, as Jehovah's Witness does, it means you're going to have a pretty aggressive missionary strategy. Part of that is the publishing of the Watchtower, which is the main publication of Jehovah's Witness. I get them in my door all the time. There's always Jehovah's Witness missionaries walking around Philadelphia handing out these pamphlets, which are very interesting to read. Here are just some I grabbed off of Google Images here. And so even though these start as American faith systems, they are international because of the missionary efforts. So that includes all forms of Christianity. And so in this case, Jehovah's Witness and the Church of Latter-day Saints are included. Another example of the new religious movements, and especially the global ones, the Hare Krishna movement, which is officially known as the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. And here we can see some Krishnas who are singing. They look blissful, very happy. And here are the lyrics to what they're singing. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So the history, brief history of the Hare Krishna movement. It pops off in the 60s, and it starts when Guru Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada comes to the United States. He is a adherent of Vaishnavism, which is a worship of Vishnu. Remember back to the development of the devotional sect of Hinduism. And so he arrives at a time when the U.S. counterculture is blooming. And it's a big reason why the Krishna consciousness movement becomes really popular. So the basic beliefs are nowadays what people often think of as a kind of classic Hinduism, which isn't always the case. But its core of Krishna consciousness is Bhakti Yoga. And Bhakti Yoga is the yoga of devotion. In this case, devotion to Krishna, who is an incarnation of Vishnu. And the central text of Krishna consciousness is the Bhagavad Gita, right? That one section of the Mahabharata, which was the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna about everything, right? About oneness with the universe, about karma and dharma, about ahimsa and all of that. And so part of the practices of Krishna consciousness includes ahimsa, right? Anything to do with nonviolence, which includes vegetarianism. It also includes a lot of kirtan, right, which is devotional singing and dancing, which is what these individuals are doing down here. When you see the Krishnas together, they're singing, they're bopping around. Also, hapa meditation, which I'm not seeing any right here. There's some in this person's bag, but those are the prayer beads that people work through. And also, I should say, central tenet is Krishna consciousness. And Krishna consciousness is not exclusive. So the idea is that you devote yourself to Krishna, but Swami Prabhupada explained that if your God that you love embodies those lessons, then you can continue to believe in that religion and participate in Krishna consciousness. So, for example, like the true teachings of Jesus of Nazareth are very much in line with Krishna consciousness, right? To be peaceful, to take care of your neighbor, to just be loving, So, like, it's not exclusive. Nothing in Krishna consciousness said you had to abandon your Jewish upbringing or your Buddhist background, right? Or your Christian background, that you could continue. So with that teaching and the popularization through the biggest cultural phenomena of the 60s, the Beatles, this becomes a really big movement. George Harrison of the Beatles becomes a devotee. You can see him here in the middle of a kirtan circle. And then he brings the other Beatles into it, although they don't stay for the long run. I'm sure Ringo was right out. Paul didn't really stick around very much, nor John. But that said, it has a big effect on their music. If you listen to Rubber Soul or in the other later albums, you can hear a lot of, Indian influence on that. And so it helps to popularize the movement. So whether people totally join the Hare Krishna or whether they tap into other Eastern or Indian cultural practices like yoga or transcendental meditation, Ayurveda, or fashion, whatever, it just helped to kind of usher in that culture to the West and open up those lines of communication. So because of all of this, there are millions of Krishnas around the world, Hare Krishna practitioners. There has been a decline of Hare Krishna practitioners in the West, but throughout different parts of Asia and still in India, there are a high number of conversions and people who are really devoted to the practice. So this is a really good example of, global new religious movement. Another example is the Falun Gong. So the Falun Gong is not international, truly, but is a really good example of why these NRMs pop up, which is people are questioning the world around them and they want that spiritual comfort. And so the Falun Gong was a spiritual movement that became popular in China in the 1990s. So this is happening when China is kind of opening up, as we saw when looking at the era of Deng Xiaoping. Post-Mao China was opening economically and somewhat politically in terms of doing business with the outside world and allowing students to travel and stuff like that. But a lot of their personal freedoms were not opening, which is, the frustration and what we saw in the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. And so wanting that comfort, the Falun Gong movement became really popular. It's not bringing in new outside ideas, but it's regenerating old ideas. And essentially Falun Gong is almost like a blending of parts of Buddhism and parts of Taoism. And there's a lot of meditation and a lot of like spiritual movement that was meant to kind of heal souls and reveal bigger truths. At first, the Chinese government didn't care because it seemed like a tiny little organization that wasn't going to threaten them. But by the 1990s, there were over or around 30 million practitioners. And that's when the Chinese government became concerned and thought that they were going to become a problem. So the Chinese government deemed the Falun Gong a heretical organization. And after that, there was so much imprisonment and what's believed to be a lot of human rights abuses. You'll see here on the slide a propaganda poster against the Falun Gong, which says uphold science and eradicate superstition. So they're trying to write off the Falun Gong as just a bunch of superstitious, crazy people who were enemies of science, which kind of the part of the whole kind of the Communist Party of China's thing is that they are efficient and that they were growing because of how much they upheld science and engineering and were rational. And so that's how they tried to write them off. But of course, like a really big issue is like the disappearance of a lot of these members of the Falun Gong. It's believed that millions have been imprisoned and some were never seen again. So this is a protest by people demanding that international bodies do something about how many Falun Gong members have been unfairly imprisoned and is believed killed. And one of the beliefs is that Falun Gong members who've been imprisoned, that their organs have been sold on illegal organs markets throughout the world, which is what's being protested here. It should be no surprise that the Chinese government has persecuted this religious group because it's kind of like a theme in the late 20th and into the 21st century, as we've seen with the Chinese government treatment of Muslims, specifically in the Uyghur region. So unfortunately, this is a continuity, and maybe not throughout time, but in this era, this is a trend, I should say, that we're seeing. But the Falun Gong movement is interesting. NRM, right, it's in some way trying to tap back to the past to create comfort from present suffering. And our final look at these NRMs and global spiritual movements is the Bahá'í Faith. The Bahá'í Faith is super interesting and a really appropriate way to end our learning of the year. So the Bahá'í Faith originated in Persia in the 1860s and became really popular throughout the 1900s. So it was established by Baha'u'llah, who was originally an adherent of the Bahá'í Faith, who was founded by Bab. Don't think I'm really saying that well. But essentially the Bahá'í Faith was rooted early on in Shia Islam, but began to depart from it, and it taught that God would soon send another prophet. And so, originally rooted in that faith, Baha'u'llah had a revelation by God, and that revelation preached that essentially that God has always been revealing him or it or herself, their self, and that all religions are connected, that all religions are true, and in fact, all religions are one, right? That there's a belief in the unity of God. And that the way that it's explained the Baha'i Faith is that the first revelation of God was through Abraham. And then God was revealed again through Krishna in India. And then again by Moses, right? And the establishment of the Ten Commandments and all of that. And then again, God revealed himself to Zoroaster in the founding of Zoroastrianism. And then God revealed himself again to the Buddha, and then to Jesus, and then to Muhammad, and then to the Bab, and then to Baha'u'llah in the founding of the Baha'i Faith. So the Baha'i Faith is a super universalist faith, right? That there's unity of humans, unity of God, and unity of religion. And so their belief not only is that are all humans truly equal because they're all made by the same God, but that everyone should work towards making that a reality on earth. So the Baha'i Faith believes in equality between men and women. It's not super progressive when it comes to things, other forms of like gender expression and homosexuality. So it's not like it's totally kind of idyllic religion of sorts, since it was rooted in 19th century Iran. So there is that issue. But otherwise, they believe that not only is there equality, but you should always work to eliminate all forms of prejudice and injustice, which also includes class injustice. So they believe the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty. But the Baha'i Faith isn't really welcome in some parts of the very rich Middle East because of things like that. They believe that they need to work towards world peace and a new world order, and that you do that by trying to push for more equality amongst everyone. But that also that if they're so, it's really kind of sweet. Baha'i Faith believe that the two main sources of war in the world is fighting over religion and um, and miscommunication causing conflict. So they believe that, if everyone believed in the same God, or not just believed in, but recognized that the gods that they worshipped were in fact all the same, that would eliminate a lot of conflict. They also promote creating a universal auxiliary language because they believe that if everyone literally spoke the same language, and that language was a neutral one, not one pushed by like an oppressive government or by a colonizer, that would allow for communication and lessen violence over time. So there's that. So they believe in all these like really lovely things like that. And so there are millions of practitioners throughout the world, mostly in Asia. There are not a lot of Westerners who practice it. There are pockets in Africa, specifically in Uganda, where there's pretty big populations. And the nine-pointed star is their symbol in the nine revelations of God. This is the main center of the Baha'i Faith, which is in Haifa, Israel. And here is the most famous Western practitioner of the Baha'i Faith, Rainn Wilson, Dwight. So you know one Baha'i practitioner, if not maybe you know more. But yeah, that's kind of like our final example of that. And I think a nice way to end our learning for the year. So thank you very much.